Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 43 of the Ask Historians podcast. So our topic today is African urbanism, and by that we mean we're going to be looking at the growth of cities in Africa, and we are not going to be skimpy on the geographic breadth of this conversation. My co-host Mike is talking to one of our moderators and flared users, Commustar, about this. They're going to start up in Egypt, back in the New Kingdom and beyond there, swing down the Horn of Africa, down the East Coast, down into Southern Africa, back up into West Africa, talk a little bit about colonialism, jump back down to the Kongo area, and then back into kind of central sub-Saharan Africa, around the Lake Chad area, and in northern Nigeria as well. So it's a very broad and sweeping overview of the growth of the kingdoms and centralized cities and urbanized areas in Africa. So it's an excellent episode to listen to get a springboard into discussing other topics as well. So it's a broad overview, of course, but it's also a very kind of interesting look, and the fundamental question behind it is, and the question they're going to start off with in this episode is, what constitutes a city? What do we call a city? And kind of discuss a little bit, kind of contrast these older ideas of it being this purely ideal kind of orthodox Mesopotamian style city with more of a systems approach where you look at it and say, well, I'll let them explain it, but just keep in mind as we go through this episode of these themes of who lives in a city, what is the organizing principle of it, and what is its function within the larger society. So I hope you enjoyed the episode.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I am your host for today, Jasfss, otherwise known as Mike. And today with us, we're going to be talking a little bit about Africa in a broad sense, looking at the history of African urbanism with one of our flares and moderators, Commustar. So welcome, Commustar.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about your flair and what kind of got you interested into this subject of African urbanism, because you deal with the Swahili Coast mainly, but we're going to be covering a very broad spread here. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
I got interested in the Swahili Coast. Mostly it's an amateur interest. In high school, in university, there really wasn't much courses or much attention paid to Africa before colonization. The basic format is you have something about Mali, something about Egypt, and then the slave trade, colonization. And so my personal interest in Swahili Coast in the Sudanic states is because I never encountered it. And in the questions that we get at Ask Historians, I think that you have a lot of misunderstanding or not that much understanding about Africa. So some of the questions presume that there isn't cities when there were. And even among experts, even among scholars of the 1950s, of the 1940s, there wasn't an understanding that there were cities. The imperialist school of history and of archaeology, the view was that what cities that there were came from outside of Africa and were that idea was brought to Africans, and that like in the Sudanic states, that cities were brought from Arab traders, and the impetus behind building cities was from Arabs, and that local African peoples had a peripheral role.
So we're seeing kind of that the thought is that they borrow, that there was no kind of native buildup of any kind of city structure, anything that could be recognized as a city structure. And
right.
When does this school of thought kind of end? When do we see more of a look at this African urbanism idea?
Well, the end of the imperialist school really, I would date it to the 1960s, the late 1960s. In the 1970s, you have a reassessment, partly driven by the decolonization movement. By 1970, all except for a very few countries were decolonized. And also in the 1970s, you have a greater interest in you have a trend in archaeological work looking at these cities, looking at Gene in the inland Niger Delta, looking at the Swahili cities on the East African coast, and looking at archaeological data that does not fit that narrative, that and finding out that these cities date to far earlier than could be explained by contact from Arabs, contact from Carthaginians, contact from people, and a steady development from a simple, I shouldn't say simple, but from a very limited village structure to progressively more complex city structure developing there. So not to jump ahead of ourselves too much here, but
what kind of was the difference between what this Mediterranean model of cities and Middle Eastern models of cities you kind of see with that, as opposed to what is becoming accepted as the African model of cities? What was the big disparity there?
Well, so in this older model that was of what defines a city, that all of that was took as its archetype the cities of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian cities are undoubtedly the oldest cities, and so archaeologists, scholars looked at temple structures, governmental palaces, walls, and ports, and looked at these buildings, and if they didn't see something that reflected that, they viewed it as not constituting a true city. It only constituted a large village. But in this newer school since the 1970s, they've tried to look at a model that sees that more of a systems approach. You see a city as a place of specialization of labor. So you do have specialization of religious labor. You have ulama, Muslim religious scholars. You have specialization of cloth weavers, dyers, tradesmen. You have merchants trading in and out of the city, and also a city as being more cosmopolitan than a village or a agricultural hinterland. You have merchants coming in. You have different layers of wealth. People who have more wealth rubbing elbows again with people who have less wealth, and people of different ethnicities or different languages living together in a defined area, in a built-up area, which you wouldn't really see in a village. And also, the system model sees cities as interdependent with the countryside around them. So the countryside provides food, provides resources, and the city provides specialized labor to turn those raw materials into finished materials.
Right. So when you're talking about this stratification and the specialization of classes, the earliest thing that a lot of people would think of is on the African continent would be Egypt. So is that kind of where we see the first cities on the African continent coming about, or the truly African forms of cities? What do we see in Egyptian urbanization?
Yes. Well, I mean, and Egyptology and archaeology in Egypt follows that basic model where in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a view that you didn't have cities in Egypt until the New Kingdom, which was around 1550 BC, or New Kingdom started in 1550 BC. And it was seeing cities as that Mesopotamian model of walled, having ports, having temple structures, and Egyptian sites, habitation sites before the New Kingdom were seen in the 1950s and 1960s as constituting large towns or villages. But reinterpreting that and looking at it, you see, and also with more archaeological work since the 1970s, you see more different types of cities. You see settlements on islands. They're called Jazeera type. Jazeera is the Arab word for island. And these settlements mostly happen in the Nile Delta region in near the Mediterranean. You see settlements along dikes along the Nile, on tells, which are built up basically artificial hills. They're settlements built on that, and then also just planned cities, just on agricultural ground. And so you have major cities like administrative centers, Amarna, Thebes, Memphis, but you also have more local administrative centers of the nomes. Or the nome would be basically this equivalent to a province or a state for ancient Egypt.
So we mentioned that the idea of cities in Africa that were not modeled on Mediterranean or Mesopotamian kind of cities it took a long time to kind of gain any ground, but here we see these Egyptian cities, and how far does this Egyptian style of cities, many kinds of styles, like you said, you have the island cities, the ones on dikes, and the planned cities, how far outside of Egyptian borders does this spread? I mean, does this really take hold in many places around the continent, or is it very local?
It has tremendous impact in the Niger Valley region. Egyptian culture was very influential on the Cushitic or Nubian peoples that are further up the Niger Valley. And so you have very famously, and I think a lot of people know of this, is the pyramids of Meroe. The pyramids that are built when the Nubian king heard about the pyramids of Egypt, but they're built in what is now the Republic of Sudan. And so you see Egyptian cities and Egyptian urban culture having an influence on these Nubian peoples further up the Nile. And you really see that the city, Nubian conceptions of what a city is and should be, is influenced by Egyptian city and Egyptian culture.
When do we see the kind of phasing out of this Egyptian style city? Because obviously you have the Egyptian dynasties end at some point. Is it
right
well after that, or is that kind of the clear cut point, or where do we see this go from here?
The Egyptian kingdom was in contact, and it was conquered by succeeding Near Eastern kingdoms, by the Assyrians, by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and then eventually later on by Alexander the Great. And so in that period of from 330 BC until the Roman Empire, you really see those Mediterranean styles, the Greek style city being built in Alexandria, and also Roman views of city really changing that and being adapted and being brought into Egypt. And then in Nubia, you have, I already mentioned Meroe. They continue on, and the Meroitic kingdom continues on. It's contemporary with the Roman Empire. So digs at Meroe, which is on the Upper Nile. It's right before the branch of the White Nile and the Blue Nile. Digs there have found that its early ironworking goes back to 200 BC, and then you have a building up of an iron industry around 1st century AD, and you see a lot of trade along the Nile Valley of the in east and west of the Nile of Meroe, west in the Darfur region, and east into the Ethiopian highlands. You see a lot of evidence of trade, the ivory trade and trade in slaves, and also Meroe as a center of ironworking. So they are trading iron to the people to the east and west of them for ivory, for slaves, for raw materials, timber. But this ends around 350 AD, where it is believed, because it was an Aksumite army, an army from what is now Ethiopia, came in and conquered and put an end to Nubian. Because of that, Aksumites were also a trade-based empire or trade-based kingdom, and so it was an effort to steer trade through Aksum.
So we do eventually see the end of this Egyptian style and kind of this taking over or implementation of Greek and Roman styles, but what we think of today in Egypt and a lot of North Africa are Muslim styles of architecture, correct? So can you talk a little bit about the kind of Muslim expansion into North Africa and its effect on urbanism there?
Right. Well, I mean, the early Islamic Caliphate, the Rashidun caliphs, and the early Umayyad caliphs, you really have to see the caliphate as an urban centered state. The Rashidun caliphs, who are the four caliphs after Muhammad, had their administrative center at Medina, and then the Umayyad caliphs bring their administrative center to Damascus. And very soon after Muhammad's death in 632 AD, by 642, Arab armies had conquered the Byzantine province of Egypt, and the general who led that army that captured Egypt, named Amr ibn al-As, he founded a city called Fustat, basically at the apex of the Nile Delta, at the where it begins to branch out. He builds a city called Fustat as an administrative capital to administer this new land brought into the Dar al-Islam, and he peoples it with the soldiers who accompanied him on his campaign, and also the families of these soldiers also make a part of the population.
So this is a completely new city that's being formed. It's not just the structure that's being imposed. It's just the whole thing is new. Yeah,
and Fustat is the capital of Umayyad and then later Abbasid Egypt for the next 500 years. And then you also have, similarly, in 670, Arab armies are pushing across North Africa. They're making their way towards what is now Morocco. In 670, they reach Tunisia. They called it Ifriqiya. And in this period from 650 to 670, there were several reversals of fortune. There was Berber revolt because of Berber resentment of Arabs taking Berber slaves, and also Berbers taking Islam, and sort of they had a religious revival in turn because of Islam being brought in, and so there was a large Berber revolt. So that sort of pushed Arab conquest back, and so in 670, I'm forgetting his name. It was Uqba ibn Nafti, who was the Umayyad governor of Ifriqiya, built Kairouan, which is about 50 miles inland from Tunis, and it was first built as a fortress, and it was built as a fortress as well as an administrative center for holding on to North Africa, for holding on to Ifriqiya, and then later on in the 700s, once the conquest of North Africa, once the administration of North Africa was more secure, Kairouan develops into a center for Quranic scholarship. There are built many madrasas, which are basic schools for scholarship, and it develops a strong reputation.
So under these Umayyad cities, in the Egyptian cities, you have the stratification, and then I'm assuming also in the Umayyad cities, you have stratification, but how does this kind of fall? Is it economic stratification? Is it purely religious stratification? And also, if it's economic and a mix of religious, how much does kind of racial politics play into this? This wouldn't be within
North Africa. This would be within Al-Andalus in Spain. I know that there was a separation between Arab and Berber. Berbers constitute much of the army that captures Al-Andalus, but you do have the governor and then later the Umayyad emirs are dispersing governorates and dispersing fortune and wealth upon fellow Arabs, and that leads to a period of civil war in Al-Andalus. In that period, you also have muwashasha, which is just poetry, and some of those poems mock the savagery of the Berbers. But I guess in North Africa, what you could say is that in North Africa, you do have Berbers creating their own cities, you do see the common view is that North Africa becomes very Arabized, but in the 700s and 800s, you do really have the founding of Berber cities in Morocco. You have, in the 800s was built Fez, and around 1000 you have Rabat being built. And you also, in the 800s, you do have the sort of spinning away of Berber emirates from the Umayyad center, from the Abbasid center. The Abbasids take over in 750, and they really aren't able to control everything. And so you have in North Africa, in what is now Algeria, in Morocco, these Berber kingdoms founding cities and sort of spinning away from the Arab center.
Okay. And then you also have the Fatimids come in at some point, correct?
Yeah. The Fatimids, they originally come out of an area what would now be Tunisia and western Libya, and their name Fatimid comes from they were Shiite, and they claim descent from Fatima, who was the most famous wife of Muhammad, and so they claim to be related to Ali and related to Muhammad through Fatima. Ali was the husband of Fatima. They build up their armies through slave. They build up slave armies. They build up armies of Circassians from the Caucasus, Turks, as well as armies from Zawila, Zawila was a trade center, and so these Zawila regiments were from sub-Saharan Africa, and they had been taken from the Lake Chad region and brought to North Africa. And so the Fatimids take these slave armies, and they actually move east. They take over Egypt, and the Fatimids were the ones who founded Cairo in 968. And so Cairo was built very close to the site of Fustat. So Fustat is sometimes known as Old Cairo. And so if you go to Cairo, you can actually go and see Fustat as a section of it, and then modern Cairo has sort of grown all the way around. In Cairo, being at the apex of the Nile and being along the Nile region, it was also a very important region in trade. And by the 1200s and 1300s, the Venetians, the Genoese, different Italian Catholic traders were trading in Alexandria, were trading in Cairo, and so that led to a great deal of wealth in Egypt under the Fatimids, and then later among the Ayyubids, among the Mamluks. And so 1500s, Cairo might have had a population of 500,000 people, so probably the largest city in Africa in that period.
Right, quite big. So obviously there's a lot of stuff going on in North Africa at this time, and it has kind of this proximity with the Mediterranean, and has this proximity with the Middle East, and these caliphates coming over and kind of doing their thing. But you mentioned the Aksum, the Aksums, which would be kind of Ethiopia area. So what is going on over there at this time, and how do they kind of develop in their urban structure and model?
Aksum, which is a city, and the state is named after the capital city. That state would be in what is now Eritrea, and also in a part of northern Ethiopia. They were very involved in trade. They were involved in the seaborne trade along the Red Sea, but also they traded with their inland neighbors. They also, like the Nubians from Meroe, they were trading in ivory, in timber, in agricultural goods with their inland neighbors, and so that generated a lot of wealth. The archaeological sites that we have from Aksum and the preceding Damot culture show a lot of influence from the Sabaean kingdom. Sabea was in what's now Yemen, so southern Arabian Peninsula, and so in these archaeological digs you see temples. You have Ge'ez, which is the writing system, and in reading the inscriptions on these temples, you see that the pantheon, the religious pantheon, is adopted from the Sabaean religious pantheon. You see that the temples are laid out similarly to Sabaean culture. You see the iconography of the religious pantheon is the same. And so you really see a shared or a borrowing of culture from Sabea, which was just 50, 100 miles across the Red Sea from ancient Aksum. That influence was from around 1st century BC until around 300, and then around 300 you see the Christianization of Aksum under King Azana. That comes when Bishop Frumentius, who was from Syria, comes and meets Azana and converts him, and then converts the country.
So is this initial kind of borrowing of culture is kind of like what the Romans would have done with the Greeks? They're kind of close neighbors. They kind of model everything after they borrow quite a bit. There's
yes.
Lots and lots of crossover.
Yeah, and also so the Sabaean temples, the Sabaean religion, the Sabaean culture, Rolando Fadovich and Stuart Monroe-Hay and different Ethiopian scholars of Ethiopia argue about whether, so these urban sites, are these a elite who are adopting the Sabaean trappings of culture, and how much does this affect the rural farmers? And we really don't have anything to suggest that this adoption of Sabaean culture reaches outside of the cities in any significant extent. And there's not much evidence, but the best guess that we have is that the farmers and the hinterland continues on to believe in the traditional beliefs and is not as influenced by the Sabaean religious pantheon.
Right. So then we have this Christianization that goes on, and obviously this kind of is a very big deal within Ethiopia. So this kind of spreads out beyond the cities as well.
Yes, it does. It does. The spread of Christianity, partly that you have to understand a few historical details. In the 6th century, Aksum had control over southern Yemen. Aksum was closely tied to Christian Byzantium, and it was part of this conflict with Sassanid dynasty in Persia. And so they take over Yemen in the 550s. But with Muhammad, with the advent of Islam, at first the relationship with Islam was friendly, but growing Muslim power in the Mediterranean, growing trade power, growing naval and military power results in an Aksumite raid on Jeddah in 602 AD, and then a reprisal of a Muslim navy destroys Adulis about 15 years later, I believe. And so that closes off the Red Sea. That effectively closes off the Red Sea trade to Aksum. And so that was disastrous to the Aksum kingdom, and it forces a reorientation of the state away from the Red Sea and toward inland, towards the Ethiopian highlands. And so after around 700, you really see building, moving inland, and that's really when Christianization of Ethiopia, as we see it now, happens in the 700s. Up until 1100, when you have an Agao dynasty, the Zagwes, that Ethiopia had a firmly Christian culture then, and under the Zagwes, it's displayed in the construction of Christian churches hewn out of rock at Lalibela.
Okay, so you have this move away from trade orientation and towards an expansion. So does this highlight itself in terms of the stratification of these social classes? Was there more kind of an emphasis on a trading class, a merchant class before, and maybe something more towards maybe a soldier class or something like that in these cities? Or
actually, I think I buried the lead right there. After the destruction of Adulis and the reorientation inland, by around 1080, you really see the abandonment of urban culture. Aksum becomes less important, and you see the court of the king becoming semi-nomadic. They move around the different provinces of the different sub-kingdoms of Ethiopia, and they take up residences in fortified camps, really. And part of this is because they need to be able to put down separatist tendencies in the different sub-kingdoms. They need to be able to enforce, basically show the flag and prevent. Ethiopia is a very mountainous country, so it would be the terrain is very fortuitous for an attempt to secede and create your own little statelet. Mm-hmm. And so that was part of it. And then also part of it is that the Ethiopian king, his court, and his imperial bodyguard, which would be effectively the core of the army, was large enough that no province, no region could really support the king for more than 1 or 2 growing seasons. And so you really see the falling away of an urban culture in favor of a nomadic king and his regime, and the rest of the state goes to a farming village style kingdom up until around the 1500s, up until contact with the Portuguese, and then with the building of Gondar in 1635 by Emperor Fasilides. Gondar is really the first administrative city capital in Ethiopia in about 1,000 years.
When they have these kind of cities being built back up after this long stretch of these disparate kind of spread out nomadic collections of people, what are the styles that we see? What are kind of the organizations that we see? Does it lean towards more of the Portuguese colonial influence, or?
Well, the Portuguese were interacting with they weren't colonizing Ethiopia. They were contacting and trading, right, and as fellow Christian. But right, yes, you do have some influence. You do have Fasilides builds a castle in Gondar, and that was inspired by Portuguese military architecture. And also, you do have the building of letter churches. Also, one theme of Gondar and the Gondarian period is you have the many different religious, ethnic groups being brought together in Gondar. The Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, are used as skilled tradesmen. They are brought in to construct palaces, public works, and used as skilled
stonemasons, things.
Stonemasons, yeah.
So what you see is kind of is it kind of a mix of Portuguese and kind of these earlier influences, or is it more leaning towards? Yeah,
before the construction of Gondar, Aksum was held in a high regard. Solomonic dynasty, which comes to power in 1270, they hold their coronation ceremony in the ruins of Aksum, and so they invoke the legitimacy of this ancient Aksumite state and see themselves as a continuation. And so that does get brought into Gondar, and into what they are thinking and feeling when they build Gondar, and how they see that as a capital of the Ethiopian kingdom.
Okay, but basically it's this kind of renewal of trade that spurs back on this urbanization trend from this long period, right? This trade with the Portuguese.
It was. I wouldn't say it was really trade. I would say it's the growth of Gondar is really spurred by the growing power of the Solomon dynasty. It was really a attempt at an administrative capital.
Okay. So there's quite a bit going on there then that kind of coincides with this.
Yeah, and so they're really seeing Gondar both as like the continuation of Aksum, but they're also are inspired by European ideas of the city as the seat of government and of the utility of a city or a capital as the center of a kingdom. And so Gondar goes into the process of building of a kingdom.
What about a little bit farther south on the East Coast in kind of these Swahili regions, because we're kind of doing a nice swoop down here, but what do we see there? Do we also see kind of influences from other places being borrowed early on, or do we see influences from Aksum and Ethiopia region being borrowed? Or
the clearest evidence we have writings from the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is written in Roman Egypt in the 1st century AD. It mentions ports in East African coast. There is a long tradition of trade from Arabia to East African coast, even before Muhammad, even before before Islam. But by around 800 AD, we really have firm archaeological evidence of trade between Arabs, between the people of Iran, with these local populations, these Bantu-speaking populations along the coast of East Africa. And so around 800 AD is the earliest that we have, or the earliest evidence we have for settlement on the island of Kilwa Kisiwani, which is off the coast of Tanzania. You see sort of a progressive building of settlements for trade in iron, trade in slaves, trade in timber, copper, gold, if there is any, with these coastal people. The first settlements are made from mud and wood, perishable materials, but later on, after 1000 AD, after 1200, you start to see building of houses in coral or houses in stone. It's a progressive. So as one person builds their stone house or their coral house as a sign of wealth, the person's neighbors, the person competing trader will build their house out of stone, and so you get the
so it's kind of it's
towns.
Kind of a keeping up with the Joneses kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, my neighbor had a stone house, I have to have a stone house now.
Yeah. and so looking at the stone towns of Kilwa Kisiwani or of Lamu Island or the early stone towns of Zanzibar, the layout of the towns resembles the Arab towns of Iraq or of Arabia, of Medina. And so there have been actually archaeological comparisons done of orientation of the roads to take advantage of the trade winds, which would be very to cool down, which was very necessary in Arabia, but and so that is adopted in Kilwa, and so that shows the evidence of Arab influence.
Right. I was going to ask how much of it is kind of function over form, and as you're saying, it's kind of there is evidence that there is quite a bit of form going on here. Yep. Okay, very interesting. So you did mention that there is quite a bit of trade going on, and you mentioned that there's some gold trade, if there is any, but
there was, so the Kilwa Kisiwani becomes the most powerful city. So these Swahili Coast was organized politically into city-states. So there was Kilwa Kisiwani, there was Mombasa, there was Mogadishu, there was Mafia Island, and they were competing with each other with trade. And Kilwa Kisiwani becomes the wealthiest, the most influential, of the richest of these city-states, because around 1200 AD they gain control of Sofala, which is in what it is now southern Mozambique, and it is along a river, the mouth of a river that so it formed a direct trade contact with the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe, so in what is now Zimbabwe, and the gold trade there, so the gold from Zimbabwe comes to Sofala, and it goes to Kilwa Kisiwani, which is about half halfway between Sofala and Arabia, so it's the natural halfway stopping off point, and so Kilwa Kiswani gains control of the trade from Sofala, and the gold trade was an enormous part of Indian Ocean trade.
Right, so everything's still kind of centered around the coast of this kind of stretch. How connected are these cities
with each other? They are. So each trader had. So a Swahili trader is basically an independent person. He isn't tied to a city-state. He isn't a citizen of Kilwa Kiswani. He isn't a citizen of Mogadishu, whatever. Each of these city-states will be competing with each other to draw the traders, to draw commerce to them. So for most of this period, it is a trade competition. They see each other as fellow. They see each other as culturally similar as of people of the coast, and see themselves as tied to Arabia. See the ruling dynasty of Kilwa sees themselves as they claim descent from a prince from Shiraz. And so they see themselves as similar to people of the coast, but it was really a sort of a competitive relationship of the different city-states rather than a cooperative.
How much kind of contact do these cities have with Europe, either directly or indirectly, with European traders, I should say, rather?
The Swahili traders do make it into the Red Sea. They do trade with Egypt, but they don't have direct contact with Europeans until 1500, until Vasco da Gama makes it around Cape of Good Hope and makes it into India. By 1500, by 1516, the Portuguese are coming in with armed caravels, with armed small armadas. They're attacking these small cities, and Kilwa Kiswani gets attacked in, I believe it was 1520, and gets captured. And part of justification for war that the Portuguese use is that there's a trade dispute between Kilwa and one of their neighboring states, and the Portuguese insert themselves into that dispute. And so the Portuguese say that they're championing this other state and attack Kilwa. And so
they'd probably take off with quite a bit of gold in the end as well.
Yeah. So the Portuguese end up taking over basically all of these city-states and wrecking them and just completely destroying the commerce of the region. So the Portuguese, and part of that influence, part of that early period, in the 1500s, is Portuguese are establish a colony in Mozambique. So that's a remnant of that period. And the Portuguese were looking for gold. And so they set up a colony in Mozambique, and they try to go up the Zambezi and up the Limpopo rivers, looking for Mutapa, which is the successor state to Great Zimbabwe, and looking for that gold from the Zimbabwe plateau. So going back to the Swahili states, the reason why we don't have Portuguese influence continuing to be very prevalent right now on these islands off the coast of East Africa is that it was the 1650s. A dynasty from Oman in Arabia, the Busaidi dynasty, built up a fleet, and they go and they besiege Mombasa in what's now Kenya, and they basically bring these Swahili city-states into a Omani empire in East Africa. It was this Omani empire that builds up Zanzibar. Zanzibar becomes the local administrative center of this East African empire. And the I believe it was the Busaidi, it might have been the succeeding dynasty, that begins clove plantations on Zanzibar Island and on the Tanzanian coast adjacent to Zanzibar Island, makes Zanzibar a very important trade center in the 1700s.
Right. So where we start off with these disparate kind of traders, these Swahili traders, and then the Portuguese insert themselves. They're under this Oman rule. They're under this dynastic rule, but how much do they return to these kind of Swahili trading ports that they were before, or are they even more connected now? Or
they are more connected. The policy of the Busaidi dynasty after 1650 was mostly to do benign neglect. They didn't interfere too much. They allowed trade among these Swahili city-states, but building up Zanzibar as the center, it's much more cohesive and less competition. It's all under one political rule, and after it was after 1700, Zanzibar becomes really in its own right the Busaidi, not the Busaidi, but the next dynasty sort of splits, and so one line of the family tree stays in governing Oman, and the other a brother sets up a part of the dynasty in Zanzibar, and that Zanzibar Sultanate, they dwell there, and so they can directly oversee governing East African lands.
So quite a bit more direct control and oversight than there was
cohesion before. Yeah.
Right. Okay. The other great power that we had kind of talked about, these Swahili Coast traders trading with, are you mentioned Great Zimbabwe. So
right.
Can you talk a little bit about Great Zimbabwe and who they are and kind of what their situation was like?
Right. So Zimbabwe comes from the Shona words Zimba Abwe, which means houses of stone, and so Great Zimbabwe is the site of the largest, most impressive of these stone-walled compounds, and Zimbabwe Kingdom gets its name from these sites with large stone walls. And so Great Zimbabwe, the settlement site, probably had around 10,000 inhabitants in 1200. These stone walls, that is the area where the king of Zimbabwe lives. That is, and the other ones, the smaller ones, those are the habitation sites of the subsidiary chiefs. And so these stone structures are really a demonstration of royal power or governmental, the ability of the ruling governor to mobilize the workforce to construct monumental structures. But a large of that 10,000 inhabitants in Great Zimbabwe that live there, much of them lived in huts of wood or straw or mud or perishable materials outside of those walls. And so if you visited Great Zimbabwe in 1200, it would have not looked like if you visited it today. You've seen many huts and outside in the outside of those walls.
What kind of classes were living inside the walls, though? I mean, who do we see socially taking up this space as being the higher? Is it just the ruling class, or is it the trading class as well? Or
trade in gold was a royal monopoly, and so the king controlled what the gold that goes outside of it. But yeah, the Stonewall compounds would be the king and his family and his court, really. The traders, they would be outside of the walls.
Okay, so it strictly was kind of this royal.
You see this in Zimbabwe. You see this in many places. This segregation of space by prestige. The king has a space and it's ordered by prestige. If proximity to the king is an indication of greater prestige. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I mean, what about inside the walls? What kind of compounds do we see? What kind of styles are we seeing? What kind of buildings are we seeing inside these walls?
Inside of these compounds, you also see huts very much like those outside the wall, but it is a larger scale, but like a larger, grander hut, but it is built of the same materials as those outside. It's these walls are really the only really permanent stone construction.
Okay, so it's just kind of a physical marker of segregation as opposed to like any kind of style form of segregation or anything like that. It's just a physical marker there. As we are traveling around this kind of big continent, we haven't touched on what's going on in West Africa, really. So,
right.
Where, I mean, the biggest name probably that sticks out to me in terms of an urban empire maybe would be like Ghana.
I just want to give a little geographical note to our listeners. When we're talking about the Ghana Empire, that was located in what is now Mauritania or in Mali. The Republic of Ghana, which is in West Africa along the Atlantic coast, it was as a colony, it was known as the Gold Coast. That is not what we're talking about. That is not the region we're talking about. Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah decided to name that state Ghana as a nod to this ancient civic state, but they're geographically not the same place. So with Ghana, a lot of what again, before 1970, a lot of what we know came from Arabic texts from North Africa or from Baghdad, from a text by Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, which basically it's a geography text. It's writing about all the kingdoms and all the states that were known to al-Khwarizmi, that were known to in the Muslim world. And so he mentions that Ghana is a place that exists in West Africa. And so for a long time, up until the 1960s, the understanding of scholars and of archaeologists was that cities in West Africa were really come about in the 8th and 9th century after Arab traders bring Arab views of what a city is, like we mentioned from Kairouan, bring those across the Sahara to West Africa. But digs by Roderick McIntosh and his wife Susan Keach McIntosh in 1979 until 1983 at Gene-Geno, they show that that these states that Gene-Geno was founded as early as 200 AD. So this was much before Arab contact, and that the towns of the Ghana Empire and the towns of the Western Sudan and along the Niger River, there was building of these towns before contact with Arab influence.
Okay, and so obviously then we can assume there is kind of some specialization of labor, specialization of trade going on before this Arab influence, where they have these separate towns being built for.
Yeah, well, and an interesting thing about these, there's a region called the Inland Niger Delta, which it goes from about Bamako, which is the capital of Republic of Mali now. It stretches along the Niger Delta up to about Timbuktu. It's a region where the riverbed splits out and separates and intertwines and it connects again, and it's a very agriculturally rich region. And so the digs at Gene-Geno and at other sites at Gao show that these they have like the central urban core, but that also outside you have building up of towns, like of smaller town sites as satellites around the urban core of Gene-Geno or of Gao. And so it also shows in these digs, it shows that there are so the materials that are available in this inland Niger region, you don't really have iron, you don't have the ore for iron, you don't have much in the way of wood, you don't have gold, but we find gold, we find iron, so in the beginning, in the early period, in 200 AD, 300 AD, 400 AD, it's mostly building up trade in this inland Niger Delta region, and it's trade in agricultural surpluses. And later on, 500 AD, 600, 700 AD, you see these trade networks spreading out and being able to bring in goods from outside of that region, from adjacent regions. So bringing in the iron, bringing in gold from the upper reaches of the Senegal River, upper reaches of the Niger River, and really see these cities becoming trade nexuses, which then we see in the Arab texts. The Arab texts treat them as trade centers.
So during this this Arabic contact and this kind of height of their trade in this region, what kind of regional influence do we see the Ghana Empire and these kind of cities spreading out in this region? I mean, how much do we see this taken up by others, or do we see this in other areas? Some of the things that, you know, they are known for, do we see this sprouting up in other places? Or is it just kind of very contained within this region?
So, for a time period, the Ghana Empire begins before Arab contact. So, best guess is maybe around 500 BC, and it lasts until around 1000 AD. And then after that, you see Mali centered around Timbuktu. You also have towns there. And Gao, which is further east along the Niger River. You do have towns, but it's hard to say if it's a influence. I wouldn't really say it's an influence of the Ghana Empire. You can't say because of the Ghana Empire they brought towns to Timbuktu or to Gao, but you really see a development of towns along the inland Niger Delta in this period from 200 to 600 AD, and Ghana is the largest, most notable one. And then after that, it sort of is centered on Timbuktu and Mali and the urban culture of Mali, and then later on Gao, capital of the Songhai.
Right. Within Songhai and within Mali, do we also see these separate towns for the Muslim traders? Do we see more of an integration of the traders into these towns and cities?
At first, you really see a separation of the traders. So going back to Ghana, so before 1000 AD, you really have separate towns for the Arab traders. Nemia Levtsian, who is a scholar of the spread of Islam in Africa, he and others have tried to explain that as sort of that the rulers of Ghana, or the rulers of these kingdoms, value the Muslim traders because Muslim traders bring writing, they bring contact with North Africa, and so the possibility of credit and expand trade horizons, and so they bring a lot of useful cultural paraphernalia with them. But these rulers also have to contend with the religious priesthood and the religious sensibilities of their subjects, and so these traders are build in separate towns so that Muslims won't be offended when the people of Ghana or the people of Timbuktu celebrate their feast days, celebrate their religious holidays, and also the local inhabitants won't be offended when the Arab traders celebrate Eid al-Adha or celebrate Ramadan or celebrate. So there's a physical separation of the Muslims and the local people to prevent violent conflict or prevent misunderstandings.
Right. So it's not so much a discriminatory thing as so much as it is kind of a sensibilities thing, or trying to prevent any of that unwanted hostility, right?
So as an aside, a lot of archaeologists attentively identify Kumbasale as the capital of the Ghana Empire. Kumba-Saleh is a site of ruins in what is now Mauritania, and that they basically identify that because the site of Kumba-Saleh basically agrees with descriptions by Muslim catalogers of where the site of the capital of Ghana was. But Roderick McIntosh disagrees. He says that Kumba-Saleh is more likely a Arab trade or a Muslim trade settlement, because in the 11th century it would not have been sited in this very rich the inland Niger Delta. It would have been basically in a poor agricultural area very close to the Sahara, and so the fact that it's constructed in stone, that it's not close to the center of urban development in West Africa means that it's probably not the site of a capital. But no one's really found a site no one has found a better candidate for where the capital of Ghana should be.
So it's just kind of a best guess kind of thing. We don't have any certainty there.
Right.
Okay. So we've talked quite a bit about Arabic influences within Africa, and we hit on the kind of elephant in the room a little bit, but not terribly much up to this point, or if you prefer, the big ship with cannons in the room on the coast. So can we talk about the European kind of colonization and coming in and setting up their cities, and what effect this has on the African urban landscape, if you will?
Right. Portuguese are the first explorers that we know of that go to West Africa, go along South Africa, and so this era of exploration, you have the founding of trading ports, or also forts that serve as defensive positions and depots for the slave trade. So St. Louis in Senegal was originally a fort, and it expands into a city, and St. Louis was very involved in the slave trade. Dakar, also a site, French site, that Port Harcourt in Nigeria, Calabar, and Cape Town, South Africa are sites that begin as trading posts, or begin as Cape Town was not in the slave trade, but begin as slave forts. So in the earliest period, before 1800, a lot of the European influence was along the coast. There was not much European penetration into the inland of Africa. After around 1830, the British begin a movement to abolish the slave trade in Britain and in their colonies. And after the Civil War, the United States also works with them, before the Civil War, in the 1850s, the United States works with them in putting a naval squadron off the coast of West Africa to stop slave trading vessels and to repatriate the cargo to Liberia or to Sierra Leone.
Right.
And so that effort in the mid 19th century to stop the slave trade, which gained some traction along many countries. French abolished the slave trade briefly during the French Revolution, but it's brought back by Napoleon. But the French finally abolished the slave trade for good in the Revolution of 1848. And so by 1850, there is this era of it's called the era of legitimate trade, and so it sees the Europeans having an economic focus on the possibilities of trade with Africa. In Nigeria, the groundnut trade becomes more important. Famously in Congo, the rubber trade becomes a source that Europeans see of. If we begin trading, it's a major driver for the following colonial scramble of Africa. And so after 1870, you have this. 1870 is a marker of when colonization really begins to take hold. But 1884, 1885, we have the Berlin Conference, where the British, the French, Belgians, the Germans, the Portuguese all set up, they come to an agreement on the processes of setting up colonies, sending an explorer and claiming and making legal claims and
right
and preventing.
This is kind of that great big division of Africa, right?
Yeah.
Where
so
they're marking out on the charts.
Yeah. The Berlin Conference is really seen as where these European heads of state do carve up the continent. In this period after 1870, in the late 1880s, 1890s, you have explorers like Henry Morton Stanley. You have Brazza for France, who are founding small forts, and these forts are the nucleus of cities. So Henry Morton Stanley founds Leopoldville at a river junction along the Nile Valley. Brazza founds a fort which is later named after him. It's named Brazzaville. So these two forts are right across the river from each other, and they become Brazzaville and Kinshasa, the capitals of. Well, Brazzaville is the capital of the Republic of the Congo, and Kinshasa becomes the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo. In the British East Africa, in what becomes Kenya, you have the founding of a small town at a railroad junction, and that town grows quickly, and it becomes what is now Nairobi. And so you see the growth of towns at strategic sites for the flow of materials, at river junctions, along the coast, at railroad junctions, and so that's a part of a driver of city growth.
So European colonial efforts and these colonial settlements were really kind of just brand new settlements that were built up. They weren't tacked on to any existing settlements around Africa, or do we have any instances where you have one of these cities that we were talking about, especially one of these stone-based cities, and then you have kind of European building upon it as well?
Well, yeah. Well, you do have many examples of that. Like, for example, in Ibadan in Nigeria, Ibadan has its origins as a military settlement of the old Oyo Empire, so a Yoruba-speaking state. It's a military post. It's founded around 1500. By the time the Europeans, by the time that the British West African Company reaches Ibadan in their efforts to build groundnut plantations in Nigeria, Ibadan has a population of 50,000, but Ibadan is a population of 1.5 million people in Nigeria today. It still grows, and it has university on the European model. It has a city hall on the European model. So you do have African cities that continue to be places of settlement in Africa, and they adapt European influences. They adopt hospitals, they adopt automotive roads, they adopt electricity, railroads, that sort of stuff.
Okay. Is there anything that you'd like to add that we just didn't get to, or you'd like to talk a little bit more about?
Well, I would like to talk about the Congo Kingdom, sort of jumping back to the early period, the early period of exploration, so the 1500s, the 1600s, the Congo Kingdom, which is actually centered in southwestern Democratic Republic of Congo and in northern Angola, the site of Mbanza Congo. It's sort of unlike the other examples of pre-colonial African urbanism that we've talked about before, because most of what we know about it is because of Portuguese writings, Portuguese friars and cardinals and explorers writing about what they see there. So the settlement in Mbanza Congo, the houses are made out of perishable materials. They made out of wood or out of grass. Portuguese writers also mentioned that a lot of the houses have woven cloth partitions that are hung around the houses, and they're a sign of wealth and sort of a decorative thing.
Mm-hmm.
Mbanza Kongo also it's the capital site, but as the Portuguese begin to interact with the Congolese, interact with the Portuguese, famously the Congo Kingdom converts to Catholicism. The kings of Congo adopt Portuguese names like Alfonso, and Mbanza Kongo goes from being a site of wooden houses and grass houses. The kings of the Congo Kingdom build stone cathedrals in the style of Portuguese cathedrals, starting in the mid 1500s. And 1549, there was a very famous cathedral known as the São Salvador. In the late 1600s, the Portuguese writers stop referring to Mbanza Kongo as that, and they start referring to the city as São Salvador. And so that cathedral becomes the naming place of the entire town. And unfortunately, there has not been any sort of archaeological work done at Mbanza Kongo. We know where it is, and there's people live there right now. It's just that, partly it's due to the Angolan Civil War. After the Portuguese pulled out of Angola in 1975, there was a long civil war between competing groups that lasted from 1975 until 2001. And then partly also it's just that there is a population there, and so it is sort of hard to begin archaeological dig in an area in a site that's already been built upon.
Right.
It's sort of access issues. But what's interesting about Congolese urbanism is that the Portuguese writings and mention that the building in stone the building in wood and in grass, and the settlement pattern, they would build these in light, insubstantial materials, and they would dwell there for a short period, for maybe 10 years or whatever, and then they would abandon that house, they would abandon that township, that city, and then they would move the population, and they would build in other areas. And so that style of settlement, that building in light, perishable materials, and then moving and building a new site, that appears to have happened before contact with the Portuguese, because there isn't any mention of moving the capital, of the movement of Mbanza Kongo. It's always mentioned as being in one place. Mm-hmm. And the switch into building into stone sort of solidifies that as being in one place. So
fantastic. Anything else?
We didn't talk about the Hausa at all. So we've talked about Ghana, and we talked a little bit about Mali and Songhai and their influence, but a couple of cultures that really get overlooked and don't really get paid attention to in terms of an urban context, except for among specialists, is the Hausa cities, as well as Kanem-Bornu. So I'm going to start off with the latter one first. So Kanem was a African culture that dwelled on the eastern shores of Lake Chad, and they are early adopters of Islam, and their strategic site, their settlement on eastern Chad allows them to be in contact with the plain of Aïr, which is in northern Niger, and northern Niger, and so Kanem had direct trade contact with North Africa, with Tripoli, Tunisia, and so Kanem, and then later Kanem-Bornu, which is a sort of a same state or sort of a succeeding similar state under a different dynasty, they were very involved in the slave trade. The Kanem-Bornu was that civilization that was trading with the Fatimids for the Zawila slave regiments. But along the shores of Lake Chad, and also in this area of northern Nigeria, southern Niger, town settlement patterns are different. I mean, they're different than further west in the western Sudanic region, because it appears it was a much more violent region. I don't want to overgeneralize, but the capital of Kanem-Bornu it's characterized by a wall. So in this central Sudanic region around Lake Chad and in southern Niger, northern Nigeria, Kanem-Bornu style of towns is a bit different from the settlement sites at Gao or Timbuktu further to the west. The capital of Bornu Empire, the capital is called Gazagarmo. It has very noticeable walls made out of brick that surround the site, and it shows the violence of the region. And Kanem and Borno and urban styles also influence the urban styles of their Hausa neighbors. The Hausa city-states are in this region in northern Nigeria and in southern Niger and parts of Chad. There were 7 famous Hausa city-states. There's Gobir, Kano, Katsina, Sokoto, Zaria. I don't remember the last 2. And these 7 sites were also sort of similarly to the Swahili states. The Hausa lands weren't one large empire. These different cities had small, I would call them like statelets, and they were in competition with each other. And Kano was a sort of a central one. And Kano is still a large city in northern Nigeria today. I believe the population is around 5 million. But Kano was in this period of 1400, 1500, 1600, was a very important trade center in Hausa land. It had trade contacts with North Africa, with Borno, and also you have religious contacts with this Western Sudan states. You have in the 1400s you have ulema, scholars from Walata, which is in what is now Mali, coming and attempting a conversion of the ruler of Kano. And then later in the later 15th century, you have more ulema, religious scholars from Timbuktu who come and they begin teaching their interpretations of Islamic law in Kano as well as in Katsina. And so also these Hausa states, their conception of a city is influenced by Kanem-Bornu. So all of these city-states have brick walls that are structurally similar. They are reflective of what you would see in Gazargamo. And so cities in the Hausa state really begin in the 14th century. Archaeologically, we really see them begin to grow and develop in the 15th century. And then skipping ahead a few hundred years, by the 18th century, you have Fulbe population, Fulfulde speakers, who were originally pastoralists. They tended to cattle and to sheep, and they move into Hausa lands. They settle in the small towns outside of these cities, these Hausa cities. And so from among one of these Fulani populations, we have Osman Danfodio, who he was from a family of ulema, and he accused the Hausa rulers of being un-Islamic, of tolerating local beliefs and sponsoring local animist festivals and religious beliefs, and introducing un-Islamic innovations to the rule of law in Hausa land. And so Osman Dan Fodio gathered together many Fulani, as well as disaffected slaves from Hausa society, and led what is called the Fulani Jihad. And his armies basically took over each of these different Hausa state, and as well as he actually made the same accusation. He made an accusation that the rulers of Kanem-Bornu were also un-Islamic for tolerating these un-Islamic innovations, and that he wanted to bring them within his caliphate. He was proclaimed the caliph, and he proclaimed his area, his political his state, where he would bring this more pure, reformed version of law and of Islam as the Caliphate of Sokoto was one of those cities. But the people of Borno, under a religious leader known as Muhammad Amin al-Kanemi, fought back and prevented Kanem-Bornu from being brought into this Sokoto Caliphate. Sokoto Caliphate, which lasted from around, the Fulani Jihad began around 1804. The Sokoto Caliphate lasted until 1900, when the British arrive.
Okay, so then under this caliphate you have bringing together of these city-state lanes that are in this region.
So it's ironic that Osman Danfodio accomplishes this hope. Like each leader of the Hausa city-states really wanted to bring together all the city-states under their own leadership.
Right.
And so it's ironic that Osman Danfodio is able to bring together within one state, led by a Fulani, led not by a Hausa. And also I should mention that he does bring in I believe it's Oyo, so part of Yoruba land, into the caliphate as well.
Thank you for this absolutely fantastic, and I know very, very broad, but at the same time.
This is only going to be a very introductory reflection of urbanism in Africa. I mean, there's a lot of things we didn't touch. There's a lot further we could go, and I look forward to the questions and comments when this is posted.
And hopefully we can get you on another time to maybe talk a little more in depth about the Swahili Coast or something else that you're very, very specialized in. All right, well, thank you for stopping by, and thank you for giving us this fantastic episode.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And as always, thank you for listening. As was noted in the interview, this is an excellent episode to use as a springboard for asking follow-up questions in our discussion post, which will, by the time you're listening to this, it'll be up in the Ask Historians subreddit, so you can drop by, and if you want to follow up on any of these topics that we covered, you can go ahead and do that. We did cover basically the entirety of Africa over, centuries and even millennia. So this is an excellent one to kind of narrow down and see if there's some sources or some follow-up questions you might want to have about specific areas, or even about the process of urbanization itself, or how do we look at an urban society, and what is the purpose and function of an urban society. So we have that example of Aksum, or kind of the post-Aksum state, where in Ethiopia, where it was essentially a traveling armed camp, and necessitated traveling by the agricultural resources available to support it, and at the same time, well, not at the same time, but we also see a different kind of settlement down in the Great Zimbabwe, Mono-Matapa, where you have this kind of physical enclosure that signifies social stratification, that is just sitting there and also acting as a major kind of economic center as well. So there's this wide range and variety of what we can say is a city, what we can say is an urban settlement, and that's sometimes these words. It's kind of, well, in an anthropological sense, we have to start from core principles and say, well, what do these words that we use actually mean? So hopefully this episode was useful to our listeners, that's you, and not only in getting a very kind of crash course in the history of Africa, but also in getting kind of a crash course in the idea of looking at complex stratified societies. So On that anthropological theme, coming up in the next fortnight, I will be talking to our guest anthropology nerd, as she is known. We will be talking about paleodemographics and bioarchaeology. So we hope to see you then. In the meantime, please do rate and review us on iTunes or however else you rate and review podcasts that you listen to. We're available on any number of streaming services. If we're not, please let me know and I'll get us up on there. But I guarantee you at this point, we're almost everywhere. We have a SoundCloud page where we put up the last couple most recent episodes. We have a YouTube page where we are slowly but steadily putting up our past episodes with kind of time codes so you can jump in between them all there. And of course, you can always find us on our Libsyn page, or you can come by and visit us at the Ask Historians subreddit, where you can come and ask questions in the follow-up post. So, see you in 2 fortnights. Well, 1 fortnight. That's 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.